Okay, so to begin with, just to start off with some key terms. Lollardy, a heretical movement which originated in the 1380s under Oxford scholar John Wycliffe. Doctrine, stated set of beliefs held and taught by the Church. Sacraments, Christian rites of particular importance. You can see them in the images. And the Catholic Church teaches that there are 7, but Protestants argued that there were only 2 sacraments during the 16th century, Eucharist and baptism. Lutheranism, a major branch of Protestant Christianity, which comes from the theology of Martin Luther. Apologies because I'm probably not pronouncing this correctly, but Zwinglianism, ideas relating to or characteristic of the Swiss Protestant reformer Zwingli, so people that follows his ideas or his doctrine. Calvinism, which was a major branch of Protestantism that followed the traditions and theological ideas of John Calvin. And the Great Chain of Being, you can see an image there which at the top should show the monarch, and if you look right down at the bottom you should be able to see, well, right at the bottom there's hell, but just above that you should be able to see things like trees and plants, above that animals, birds. It's basically a form of hierarchy, and it was the belief that God set out an order for everything in the universe. On earth, God created a social order for everybody and chose where you belong. In other words, the king or queen was in charge because God had put them there, and they were only answerable to God. This helped monarchs reinforce the idea that disobeying the monarch was disobeying God and therefore a sin. So when Elizabeth became queen in 1558, it was widely expected that she would change the nation's religion from Roman Catholicism of her sister's reign. In addition, Elizabeth did not want to be associated with Mary's legacy. The restoration of Roman Catholicism and the authority of the Pope were too closely associated in the minds of the English people with the persecution of heretics, an unpopular Spanish marriage, and also the loss of Calais. There would be a lot to be gained from embarking on a new policy that would signal a break with the immediate past and enable Elizabeth to emerge as the architect or an inspiration for a new order. For Mary, religious settlement had been a straightforward issue. She had imposed her own faith on her subjects. For Elizabeth, who was far more aware of the political complexities of the situation, the answer for Elizabeth's religious settlement was less clear. There is now little doubt amongst historians over Elizabeth's personal views. Her own translations, her book of private devotions, her private prayers, all suggest a commitment to Protestant beliefs, but she realised that religious choices she made would have important consequences both at home and abroad. First, religious changes had caused rebellions in the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI, and a policy of repression during the reign of Mary. Second, the issue of religion was tied closely to the question of Elizabeth's marriage, as it would determine the suitability and also determine possible marriage candidates. Finally, it would affect relations with foreign powers, and in early 1559, England was still allied to Catholic Spain in a war against Scotland and France. So there was lots and lots of different things there that Elizabeth had to consider. So naturally and understandably, Elizabeth's early moves were cautious. There were, however, early signs that people believed that meant that the English Church would not remain Roman Catholic. Her appointment of William Cecil as personal secretary and her instruction to Protestants to preach the first official sermons made it relatively clear to people that the English Church would not remain Catholic, and there would be therefore another change in England in terms of religion. So just to recap what she inherited, let's look back over time. Henry VII, a very devout Catholic. He didn't really engage in theological discussions, unlike Henry VIII, but he was extremely devout. He wanted to show his devotion to the church. An example would be the expenditure at Westminster Abbey. And he used the church as a tool for social order. He believed heavily in the great chain of being, and it was regularly reinforced at Mass about the importance of obedience through priests. So he used the church as a further tool of consolidation. And there were some elements of criticism to the church in the form of lollards and anti-clericalism, and Henry VIII was very open in his criticisms of anti-clericalism, which meant he had a strong ally from the Pope. Henry VIII then put an end to the Pope's authority over the church in England after his failure to secure a divorce. It was his responsibility for church doctrine, and this responsibility then came and it passed to King in Parliament. And between 1536 and 1539, some changes were introduced along relatively moderate Protestant lines, but after 1539, Henry returned to an orthodox Catholic position on doctrine. Henry dissolved monastic institutions to seize their land and their wealth, and by the end of Henry's reign, many courtiers and his son obviously were Protestant. So then under Edward, the Duke of Somerset introduced a Protestant prayer book and communion service, ordered the destruction of all images in churches, allowed priests to marry, and decided that services should be held in English rather than Latin. The Duke of Northumberland went further with the Book of Common Prayer and the 42 Articles of 1552, which generally followed the teachings of Zwingli and left no room for Catholic belief. The main influences behind religious change in Edward's reign were Archbishop Cranmer and also the young king himself. Mary restored the authority of the Pope, but obviously was unable to return the dissolved monastic lands to the church. The Latin Mass and Catholic doctrine and rituals were all enforced. Cardinal Pole attempted to improve the standard of priests, but his measures never really had time to succeed, and the persecution of Protestants earned Mary a poor reputation after her reign, which was furthered by Elizabethan propaganda. So one of the things that Elizabeth had to consider when she was thinking about the effects that her choices would have on England's relationships with other countries was looking at the situation abroad. So in terms of Spain, Spain was Catholic, but Philip II needed to maintain an alliance with England. His main concern was that a combined French and Scottish attack on England might succeed, which would cut off any access he had to the English Channel, which was his communication route with the Spanish Netherlands, so he needed to have access to that. He was therefore prepared to support Protestant England because that was lesser of an evil, if you will, against the claims of Scottish Mary Queen of Scots, who in 1558 was married to the French royal family. In France, France was England's traditional enemy. Peace negotiations were delayed because of England's insistence that Calais was returned. But in the Treaty of April 1559, Calais stayed in French hands. 3 months later, the Catholic Francis II and his 17-year-old wife Mary Stuart became King and Queen of France, and Mary also called herself Queen of England. Scotland was ruled by the French regent and widow of James V, Mary of Guise, in the absence in France of her daughter Mary Stuart. Many Scottish nobles were Protestant, and they didn't really trust the French regent. The Netherlands were under the control of Philip II of Spain in 1558. Elizabeth needed to maintain good relations as Antwerp was vital for English textile trade. It was also important to consider the relationship Elizabeth would have with the Pope. As head of the Catholic Church, the Pope could excommunicate Elizabeth, and if he officially excluded her from the Catholic Church, or from the Church, he technically released her subjects from obeying her. The Pope could also call on Catholic powers in Europe to lead a religious crusade against England and the English ruler of Elizabeth. Regarding the situation at home, the House of Lords was largely Protestant, although there were a few Catholics. The House of Lords was largely Catholic. The bishops were capable of blocking legislation, so this was a potential problem for Elizabeth. The Privy Council was largely Protestant, and it was dominated by William Cecil and his political allies. And obviously we know that Elizabeth could choose on the members of her council herself. Marian exiles had fled England during Mary's reign and strengthened their Calvinist views during their time in Geneva, and on their return they expected to be given key posts in the church and parliament and opposed any compromises with the Catholics, so they were also a group that Elizabeth had to consider. And lastly, the majority of the population. The majority of the population were conservative in their religious sympathies. And finally, looking at the church that she inherited and the things that she had to consider within that. The clergy, and particularly the bishops, were solidly Catholic. In their sermons, they urged the English people to resist Protestantism. A priest in Canterbury even began arming people against religious change, which raised fears that there might be a Catholic revolt. Within government, one of the problems within government was that as a woman as head of the church, this was seen as unacceptable to both extreme Protestants and extreme Catholics. On top of this, unless Elizabeth could persuade the Catholic bishops to remain within her church, she would have to replace them with Protestants. And this was a potential problem because it would alienate her more Catholic subjects. Also within the church is the importance of ritual. Changes in the church's visual emphasis had always caused unrest. The presence or absence of images, furnishings, priest vestments were all disputed issues which needed careful consideration. And finally, doctrine. In terms of doctrine, conservatives wanted to retain their belief in transubstantiation. In contrast, more radical reformers saw the communion service as merely commemorative. So other than the factors that we've just discussed in terms of the church, the situation at home and the situation abroad, let's have a little look at Elizabeth's own personal beliefs. She was educated by leading humanists and lived in Protestant households as a child. She was regarded as an example of piety during Edward's reign. Obviously, during Mary's reign, she was regarded as a heretic. During her coronation, Elizabeth told priests quite famously, who were carrying candles, "Away with these torches, we see very well," which obviously candles are associated more heavily with the Catholic faith, and also at her coronation the bread and wine were not consecrated during the ceremony. On Christmas Day in 1558, Elizabeth walked out of her chapel when the bishop raised the consecrated bread during Mass. In 1558, Elizabeth's Privy Council was dominated by Protestants, and Protestant preachers were invited to give public sermons. And although Elizabeth attended Protestant services in English, she actually kept crucifixes and candles in her private chapel, and this was despite the criticisms of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Dean of St. Paul's. Elizabeth was also strongly opposed to the idea of married clergymen, particularly married bishops, and could not always bring herself to be civil to Mrs. Parker, the wife of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Elizabeth liked clergymen to wear vestments and for hymns to be accompanied by choir boys and the organ. And Elizabeth disliked long sermons and found endless theological debates that a lot of Protestant reformers liked very tiresome. So it's worth thinking about all of those things and picking out those that show sort of more Catholic sympathies alongside or versus the stronger Protestant views that Elizabeth clearly had.